They took everything from us, our names, our history, our faces on those walls, but they could not erase US. We built that.
Let me stop you right there. Before you take another bite, before you flip another burger, you need to hear this. The greatest civilization in human history. The one with the pyramids, the gold, the medicine, the mathematics, the astronomy, the architecture that still makes modern engineers sweat, was built by Black Africans. Full stop. No asterisk. No footnote. That is the fact, and we are going to walk through it together today, with names, dates, bones, DNA, and receipts so thorough that nobody at this table will ever be confused again. Ancient Egypt, Kemet, the Black Land. That is what they called it themselves. Not the Greek name, not the Roman name, Kemet. And the people who built it, who governed it, who prayed in its temples, and carved its monuments, and wrote its texts, and performed its surgeries, and mapped its stars. Those people were African. They were dark-skinned. They were woolly-haired. They looked like the people you see every day walking the streets of Lagos, Accra, Nairobi, and right here at this cookout. That is not a political statement. That is archaeology. That is genetics. That is art history. That is what the ancient Egyptians said about themselves with their own hands, in their own paint, on their own walls. Now here is where people get confused, and the confusion is not accidental. For about 200 years, a very specific academic and political project worked overtime to separate Egypt from Africa. To make it a thing that floated in the Mediterranean, culturally attached to Greece and Rome, spiritually connected to the European tradition, racially ambiguous enough that nobody could claim it as black. They put Egypt in a category called the Near East. They called the people Mediterranean. They argued about hair and skin tone like they were not looking directly at paintings and sculptures that showed dark brown, reddish brown, and black-skinned people wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. They did all of this while the evidence sat right there in the ground, in the museums, in the genetic laboratories, screaming the truth at the top of its lungs. We are going to deal with that today. We are going to go back to the beginning, the very beginning, and trace this civilization from its roots in the African interior, through the Nile Valley, all the way to the pyramids at Giza, the temples at Karnak, the libraries at Alexandria. We are going to talk about the people who came before Egypt and built the cultural and spiritual foundation that Egypt stood on. We are going to talk about Nubia. We are going to talk about Ta-Seti. We are going to talk about the Badarian people and the Naqada culture. We are going to name names. We are going to look at the science. And by the time we are done, the question of who built ancient Egypt will not feel like a debate anymore. It will feel like what it always was, an answer that was hiding in plain sight. Let us go back approximately 10,000 years. Not to Egypt. Egypt does not exist yet. We are in the African interior, in the region that today includes Sudan, Ethiopia, Chad, and the upper reaches of the Nile Valley. This is where the story starts. This is where the cultural DNA of what would become ancient Egypt is being written. The people living here are cattle herders, astronomers, and builders. They are organized into complex social structures. They are conducting ritual ceremonies. They are burying their dead with intentionality, with grave goods, with a theology that already contains the seeds of what would later be called the Egyptian Book of the Dead. One of the most important pieces of evidence for this African origin is a site called Nabta Playa, located in what is today the Nubian desert in southern Egypt, close to the Sudanese border. Nabta Playa is a prehistoric ceremonial site that dates back to approximately 7,000 to 6,500 BCE. That is 9,000 years ago. At this site, researchers discovered a stone circle, a calendar circle, that was used to track the movement of the sun and stars. This stone circle predates Stonehenge by at least 1,000 years. It predates the pyramids by 4,000 years. And it was built by African people living in the Saharan interior. The archaeologist Fred Wendorf, who excavated Nabta Playa extensively in the 1970s and 1990s, documented not only the astronomical alignments of the stones, but also elaborate cattle burials and complex ritual architecture that showed a sophisticated spiritual and social system. These were not primitive wanderers. These were organized, intellectually sophisticated African people who understood the cosmos and were already developing the ceremonial and theological frameworks that would later define Egyptian civilization. The cattle cult at Nabta Playa is particularly significant. Cattle were sacred. They were buried with ceremony. They were associated with the divine. Sound familiar? Because in ancient Egypt, the goddess Hathor is depicted as a cow. The god Apis is a sacred bull. The iconography of cattle run through Egyptian religion from its earliest dynasties all the way to its final period. That iconography did not come from the Mediterranean. It came from the African interior. It came from the people at Nabta Playa and their cultural descendants who walked north along the Nile and built the civilization we now call Egypt. Now let us talk about Nubia, because Nubia is the word that makes certain people uncomfortable, and it should not. Nubia is the region of the Nile Valley that sits immediately south of Egypt, corresponding roughly to what is today northern Sudan and southern Egypt. The ancient Egyptians called it Ta-Seti, which means land of the bow, a reference to the legendary archery skills of the Nubian people. And here is what the historical record shows with absolute clarity. Nubia was not a junior partner to Egypt. Nubia was not a colony of Egypt. In many periods, Nubia was the source from which Egyptian culture, religion, and political power flowed. The archaeological site of Qustul, located in Nubia near the modern Sudanese border, produced one of the most explosive discoveries in the history of Egyptology. In 1979, archaeologist Bruce Williams of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago excavated a series of royal tombs at Qustul that dated to approximately 3300 BCE, before the first dynasty of Egypt. What Williams found inside those tombs was a carved incense burner, depicting a figure wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, seated on a throne, inside a palace with a Horus falcon flying overhead. This was the complete iconographic package of Egyptian kingship, and it was found in Nubia, predating the earliest Egyptian kings. Williams argued, based on this and other evidence, that the institution of Egyptian kingship, the pharaonic tradition itself, originated in Nubia and moved north along the Nile into Egypt. The academic establishment was not happy about this conclusion. The debate raged, but the artifact exists, the dating exists, the iconography exists, and the implication is clear. The political and spiritual architecture of ancient Egypt was born in Black Africa, south of what we now call Egypt's border. The Badarian culture, which flourished in Upper Egypt between approximately 4400 and 4000 BCE, is another critical link in this chain. The Badarian people are considered the earliest pre-dynastic culture in Egypt proper. Their skeletal remains have been studied extensively, and physical anthropologists, including C.S. Kuhn, and later researchers using more sophisticated methods, have noted the sub-Saharan African characteristics of Badarian crania. The Badarian people had a sophisticated material culture. They made fine blacktop pottery that is considered among the most beautiful prehistoric ceramic work in the world. They traded goods across long distances. They had a clear theology of the afterlife, burying their dead with food, tools, and personal ornaments for use in the next world. They were the direct cultural ancestors of the people who would build dynastic Egypt. Following the Badarian culture came the Naqada culture, which is divided into three phases: Naqada, Dazas, was two, and a third, spanning roughly from 4000 to 3000 BCE. The Naqada people are the ones who took the cultural developments of the Badarian period and amplified them into something that looks unmistakably like early Egypt. Their art, their burial practices, their social hierarchy, their trade networks, all of these grew in complexity and scale across the Naqada period, until, by Naqada III, we are essentially looking at the immediate precursor to the first dynasty. The Naqada people painted their pottery with images of boats, animals, and human figures. They built large mud brick tombs for their elite dead. They developed a proto-writing system. They were doing all of this in the Nile Valley in Africa, centuries before the first pharaoh wore the double crown. And who were the Naqada people physically? The skeletal evidence from Naqada cemeteries, studied by physical anthropologists including Grafton Elliott Smith in the early 20th century, and later reassessed by scholars like Nancy Lovell and S.O.Y. Keita, shows a population with strong sub-Saharan African biological affinities. Keita, a biological anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institution, has published extensively on this question, and his conclusions are consistent. The pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egyptian population was biologically African, with the strongest affinities to populations from the Upper Nile region and sub-Saharan Africa. This is not Afrocentric speculation. This is peer-reviewed physical anthropology, published in mainstream academic journals. Now let us talk about the genetics, because this is where the conversation always ends up, and the genetic evidence is both powerful and complicated, so we need to handle it carefully. In 2017, a team of researchers published a landmark study in the journal Nature Communications. They had successfully extracted ancient DNA from mummified remains found at the archaeological site of Abu Sir el-Malek in Middle Egypt. The mummies dated from approximately 1400 BCE to 400 CE, covering a period from the New Kingdom through the Roman era. The study found that these ancient Egyptians were most closely related to ancient populations from the Levant and, to a lesser extent, from Europe. The study was immediately seized upon by people who wanted to argue that ancient Egyptians were not African. But here is what those people consistently failed to mention, and what the researchers themselves explicitly stated in the paper. The samples came from a single site in Middle Egypt during a period when Egypt had already experienced centuries of contact, trade, migration, and conquest, involving populations from the Near East, the Mediterranean, and the Levant. The researchers explicitly noted that their results could not be generalized to all ancient Egyptians across all periods, and they specifically flagged that the samples likely underrepresented sub-Saharan African ancestry because of the geographic location of the site and the time period involved. They also noted that modern Egyptians show significantly more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the Abu Sir el-Malek mummies, which suggests population movements into Egypt from the south during and after the period the mummies represent. More importantly, the 2017 study looked at a very specific slice of Egyptian history, the late New Kingdom and later periods, after Egypt had already been invaded by the Hyksos from the Near East, after extensive contact with Levantine populations, after the Assyrian invasion, after the Persian conquest, after the Greek conquest under Alexander, and during the period of Roman occupation. Of course, those mummies are going to show Near Eastern and Mediterranean genetic influence. Egypt had been a crossroads of the ancient world for 1,000 years by the time those people were alive. The question is not what the genetics looked like in 1400 BCE after all of that contact. The question is what the genetics looked like in 3100 BCE when the first pharaoh unified the two lands, and in 2500 BCE when the pyramids were being built, and in 2000 BCE when the Middle Kingdom was producing some of the greatest literature in human history. And for those earlier periods, the genetic evidence is far more limited, which means we have to look at the full body of evidence: the physical anthropology, the art, the material culture, the historical records, and the explicit testimony of the ancient Egyptians themselves. That testimony is devastating in its clarity. The ancient Egyptians depicted themselves in their art with dark, reddish-brown skin. This is consistent across thousands of years of Egyptian art. The convention in Egyptian art was to depict men with dark reddish-brown skin and women with lighter yellowish skin. This was a standard artistic convention related to gender, not race, but the baseline male skin tone used by Egyptian artists for Egyptian men is unmistakably dark. When Egyptian artists depicted foreigners, Libyans from the north and west, Syrians and Canaanites from the northeast, peoples from the Mediterranean, they painted them with lighter skin, sometimes pale, sometimes olive, sometimes yellowish. The contrast was deliberate and consistent. The Egyptians knew what they looked like, and they painted themselves dark. When they depicted Nubians, they painted them with very dark, almost blue-black skin, indicating that the Egyptians saw Nubians as darker than themselves, but clearly recognized them as related, as southern neighbors, as people who shared their cultural and spiritual world. The tomb paintings at Luxor, the reliefs at Karnak, the illustrations in the Book of the Dead, the paintings in the Valley of the Kings, in all of these contexts, across thousands of individual images spanning 3,000 years of Egyptian history, the Egyptian people depicted themselves as dark-skinned Africans. The idea that these people were white or that they looked like modern Greeks or Italians is not supported by a single image produced by the ancient Egyptians themselves. Not one. Every image they left of themselves tells a different story. Then there is the testimony of the ancient Greeks, which is particularly interesting because the Greeks are the ones whose cultural tradition Europe later claimed as its own. The Greeks were fascinated by Egypt. They visited it, studied it, wrote about it extensively, and were absolutely clear about what they saw. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE and is often called the father of history, wrote that the Egyptians had black skin and woolly hair. His exact words, in the original Greek, described the Egyptians as melanchros, dark-skinned, and with alatriches, woolly hair. Herodotus was not making a political argument. He was recording his observations as a traveler. He was describing what he saw with his own eyes when he walked through the streets of Memphis and Thebes. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, described the Egyptians and Ethiopians as black. Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian writing in the 1st century BCE, described the Ethiopians as the first of all men, and said that Egypt was a colony of Ethiopia, meaning Nubia, and that Egyptian civilization, including its laws, its writing, and its religion, originated in the south, in Black Africa. Diodorus was drawing on earlier sources, including Egyptian priests he had spoken with directly, and the picture he paints is consistent with what Bruce Williams found at Qustul, with what Nabta Playa tells us, with what the physical anthropology shows. Egypt was born in Black Africa, and its civilization flowed north along the Nile. The Roman writer Lucian, in a dialogue called Navigium, has one of his characters describe an Egyptian boy as having very dark skin, thick lips, and thin legs with woolly hair. This is a casual, offhand physical description, not a political statement, which makes it all the more credible as evidence of what Egyptians actually looked like to outside observers. The ancient world, before the modern concept of race was invented in the 17th and 18th centuries, had no particular investment in making Egypt white. The Greeks and Romans who wrote about Egypt described what they saw, and what they saw was a dark-skinned African people. Now let us talk about the monuments themselves, because the monuments are perhaps the most powerful and visceral evidence of all. The Great Sphinx of Giza is one of the most recognized images on Earth. It has been staring out across the desert plateau for approximately 4,500 years. And if you look at it, really look at it, not at the idealized reconstructions, not at the paintings that show it with a perfectly preserved European-looking face, but at the actual stone monument as it exists today, you see a face with broad features, a wide nose, and full lips. You see an African face. Napoleon's soldiers reportedly shot off the nose with cannon fire in the early 19th century, though some historians dispute the exact account of how the nose was damaged. What is not disputed is that the nose is gone. But even without the nose, the facial structure of the Sphinx is clearly African. The art historian Martin Bernal, in his groundbreaking work, Black Athena, published in 1987, documented extensively the Afro-Asiatic roots of Greek civilization and the deliberate academic project that had worked to suppress and deny the African origins of ancient Egyptian culture. Bernal's work was controversial, fiercely attacked, and also fiercely defended. But the core of his argument, that there was a systematic effort in 19th and 20th century European scholarship to de-Africanize Egypt, is supported by the historical record of how Egyptology developed as a discipline. Egyptology, as a formal academic discipline, was born in the context of European colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. The people who were building the field of Egyptology in the 19th century were doing so in a world where the enslavement of African people was either ongoing or had just ended, where European colonial powers were dividing Africa among themselves, and where the dominant intellectual framework insisted on a hierarchy of races with white Europeans at the top and black Africans at the bottom. In that context, acknowledging that the greatest civilization in human history was built by black Africans was not just inconvenient, it was ideologically catastrophic. It blew up the entire justification for colonialism and slavery. So the academic establishment did what academic establishments do when the evidence threatens the ideology. It reinterpreted, it minimized, it created alternative explanations. It moved Egypt out of Africa conceptually, even while leaving it there geographically. This is the tradition that Cheikh Anta Diop spent his entire career fighting. Diop was a Senegalese historian, anthropologist, physicist, and political activist who is one of the most important scholars of the 20th century, full stop. Born in 1923 in Senegal, Diop earned his doctorate in Paris and spent decades producing rigorous, multidisciplinary evidence for the African origins of Egyptian civilization. His major works, including Nations Negres, a culture published in 1955 and The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality published in 1974, laid out the case using linguistics, physical anthropology, melanin dosage tests on mummies, historical sources, and comparative cultural analysis. Diop argued that ancient Egyptian civilization was built by black Africans, that it was the source from which Greek civilization borrowed its philosophy, mathematics, and science, and that acknowledging this truth was essential for the cultural and political liberation of African people worldwide. The academic establishment in Europe and America largely dismissed Diop during his lifetime, but the evidence he assembled has proven remarkably durable. His melanin dosage tests on Egyptian mummies, conducted to measure the concentration of melanin in the skin tissue of mummified remains, showed levels consistent with dark-skinned African people. His linguistic analysis showed deep structural connections between ancient Egyptian and sub-Saharan African languages, particularly the Wolof language of his native Senegal. His comparative cultural analysis showed parallel ritual practices, cosmological concepts, and social structures between ancient Egypt and African cultures to the south and west. Diop was not guessing. He was doing science, and the science pointed south into Africa every single time. The UNESCO General History of Africa, a massive multi-volume project that began in the 1960s and involved scholars from across Africa and the world, dedicated significant attention to the question of the origins of ancient Egyptian civilization. The second volume of that series, published in 1981, included a chapter by Diop himself, arguing for the African origin of Egyptian civilization, and a responding chapter by Théophile Obenga, a Congolese linguist and historian who built on Diop's linguistic work. The UNESCO project represented the most comprehensive attempt by the international scholarly community to address this question with African scholars at the table, and the conclusions pointed consistently toward the African interior as the source of Egyptian civilization. And the conclusions pointed consistently toward the African interior as the source of Egyptian civilization. So let us keep pulling that thread because we are just getting started. Let us talk about the pharaohs themselves, not the idea of pharaohs, the actual human beings who sat on the throne, who wore the double crown, who held the crook and the flail, and ruled the most powerful nation on earth for 3,000 years. Because when you look at the physical evidence of who these people actually were, the conversation stops being theoretical very fast. Start with the very beginning. Narmer, the king who unified Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE and is considered by many scholars to be the first pharaoh of the first dynasty. The Narmer palette, a ceremonial slate palette, discovered in 1898 at the site of Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt, depicts Narmer wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other, the first known depiction of the unification of the two lands. Hierakonpolis is in Upper Egypt, which is the southern part of Egypt, which is the part closest to Nubia, which is the part of Egypt with the deepest and oldest African cultural roots. The first pharaoh came from the south. He came from the black African heartland of the Nile Valley. That is not a metaphor, that is geography. Move forward to the Old Kingdom, the period that produced the pyramids. The fourth dynasty, which ruled from approximately 2613 to 2494 BCE, is the dynasty that built the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Pyramid of Khafre, and the Pyramid of Menkaure. These are the most famous structures in human history. The pharaoh who ordered the construction of the Great Pyramid was Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops. His only confirmed portrait is a tiny ivory figurine, less than 3 inches tall, discovered in 1903 at Abydos. That figurine, small as it is, shows a man with distinctly African features. The man who built the largest stone structure in human history was a black African king. His son Khafre built the second pyramid and almost certainly commissioned the Great Sphinx, which sits in front of his pyramid complex and was almost certainly carved to bear his face. Look at that face. Look at it without the filters, without the idealized paintings, without the 19th century European reconstructions that somehow always managed to make ancient Egyptian faces look like they belonged in Athens rather than in Africa. Look at the actual stone. The face of the Sphinx is the face of a black African man. This is what 4,500 years of desert wind and sand have not been able to erase. The forensic evidence on this point is striking. In 1992, the New York City Police Department forensic sculptor Frank Domingo, a man who spent his career reconstructing faces from skeletal and sculptural evidence for criminal investigations, was commissioned to do a professional forensic comparison between the face of the Great Sphinx and the face of Khafre, as depicted in a famous diorite statue, now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Domingo's conclusion, based on his professional forensic analysis, was that the Sphinx and the Khafre statue did not depict the same person. But what is equally significant is what his analysis confirmed about the Sphinx's facial features. They are African. The measurements, the proportions, the width of the nose, the fullness of the lips. The Sphinx has the face of a black African man, regardless of which specific black African man it depicts. Now let us go to the Middle Kingdom, approximately 2055 to 1650 BCE. Because the Middle Kingdom is a period that does not get enough attention in popular discussions of Egypt, but is absolutely essential to understanding the full picture. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs of the 11th and 12th dynasties produced some of the most remarkable art and literature in Egyptian history. The 12th dynasty pharaohs in particular, Senusret Amenemhat II, Senusret III, Amenemhat III, left behind portrait sculptures that are among the most psychologically intense and visually powerful works of art from the ancient world. And those sculptures show faces that are unmistakably African. Senusret III, who ruled from approximately 1878 to 1839 BCE, left behind a series of portrait statues that show a man with heavy-lidded eyes, a broad nose, and full lips, with an expression of almost unbearable gravity and authority. These are not the faces of Mediterranean people. These are the faces of African people. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has several of these statues. You can go look at them. You can stand in front of them and see with your own eyes what the pharaohs of Egypt looked like. Then we get to the New Kingdom, and this is where the conversation gets really interesting, because the New Kingdom is the period that most people think of when they think of ancient Egypt. Tutankhamun, Ramesses the Great, Nefertiti, Hatshepsut. These are the names that everybody knows, and the evidence about who these people were physically is abundant, detailed, and consistently African. Let us start with Tutankhamun, because Tutankhamun is the most famous pharaoh in the world, thanks to the discovery of his intact tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter. When Carter opened that tomb, he found a treasury of objects that gave us an unparalleled window into the material world of ancient Egypt. And among those objects were portraits of the king himself. The golden death mask of Tutankhamun, which is the most reproduced image in the history of archaeology, shows a young man with a broad nose, full lips, and dark skin rendered in gold. The wooden shrine panels inside the tomb show the king and his wife Ankhesenamun in intimate domestic scenes, and both figures are depicted with the dark, reddish-brown skin that Egyptian artists consistently use for Egyptian people. The king is young. He died at approximately 18 or 19 years of age, but he is unmistakably African in his depiction. The DNA analysis conducted on Tutankhamun's mummy and the mummies of his family members, published in 2010 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, identified his Y chromosome haplogroup as R1b1A2. This result was actually suppressed in the initial public reporting and then leaked, which itself tells you something about the politics surrounding ancient Egyptian genetics. The R1b haplogroup is found at its highest frequencies in West Africa, particularly among populations in Cameroon and Nigeria. The presence of this haplogroup in the royal family of the 18th dynasty of Egypt is consistent with the African origin of the Egyptian royal lineage. It is not consistent with a Near Eastern or European origin. Now let us talk about Ramesses II, because Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, ruled Egypt for 66 years from approximately 1279 to 1213 BCE, and is one of the most documented individuals in the entire ancient world. His mummy is exceptionally well preserved and has been studied extensively. When his mummy was examined by French scientists in 1976, it was flown to Paris for conservation treatment. The examination confirmed that Ramesses had reddish hair. Now, this has been used by some people to argue that Ramesses was not African, because they associate red hair with European populations. But this argument collapses immediately when you understand two things. First, the reddish pigment found in Ramesses' hair was confirmed by chemical analysis to be the result of henna treatment applied after death as part of the mummification and preservation process, a practice that was common in ancient Egypt. Second, red and reddish-brown hair occurs naturally in African populations, including in the Nile Valley region, and has occurred there for thousands of years. The presence of reddish hair in an ancient Egyptian mummy tells us nothing about whether that person was African. What tells us something is the mummy's facial structure, which in the case of Ramesses II shows the broad features, the prominent nose, and the strong jaw of a man from the Nile Valley. His facial reconstruction, done by multiple forensic scientists over the decades, consistently produces an African face. Let us talk about Hatshepsut, because Hatshepsut deserves an entire documentary of her own, and she barely gets a footnote in most Western history education. Hatshepsut was a woman who ruled Egypt as pharaoh, not as a queen regent, not as a consort, but as pharaoh, with the full titles and regalia of a male king, including the false beard, for approximately 22 years during the 18th dynasty, from roughly 1479 to 1458 BCE. She was one of the most successful rulers in Egyptian history. She launched extensive trade expeditions to the land of Punt, which is identified by most scholars as the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti. She built the magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, which still stands today and is considered one of the great architectural achievements of the ancient world. She commissioned hundreds of monuments, statues, and obelisks. She ruled a superpower for 2 decades with extraordinary skill and ambition, and she was a black African woman. The depictions of Hatshepsut in her own monuments show a figure with the same dark, reddish-brown skin used for male Egyptian figures, adapted to a female body with the conventional artistic treatment. She is shown wearing the Kot headdress, the false beard, the double crown. She is shown as the rightful ruler of the Black Land because she was. After Hatshepsut's death, her successor Thutmose III ordered that her images be defaced, her name chiseled out of inscriptions, her statues smashed and buried. For thousands of years, Egyptologists did not know she had existed. Her name was missing from the king lists. Her monuments were attributed to her male successors. It was only in the late 19th and early 20th century that scholars began to piece together her story from the surviving evidence. The erasure of Hatshepsut from history is a cautionary tale about how thoroughly the record can be manipulated, and it rhymes uncomfortably with the broader erasure of Black African identity from the story of ancient Egypt. Now let us talk about the 25th dynasty, because the 25th dynasty is where the story gets turned completely upside down for people who thought Egypt was something other than African. The 25th dynasty, which ruled Egypt from approximately 747 to 656 BCE, was the Nubian dynasty. These were pharaohs from the kingdom of Kush, from what is today Sudan, who conquered Egypt and ruled it as pharaohs. Their leader was Piye, also known as Pianki, a Kushite king who swept north from his capital at Napata, defeated the fractured Egyptian rulers who had allowed the country to fall into division, and reunified Egypt under his rule. Piye's victory stele, discovered at Gabel Barkal in Sudan and now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, is one of the most important historical documents from the ancient world. It describes in detail Piye's military campaign, his victories over the Egyptian rulers, and his restoration of Egyptian religious and cultural traditions. Piye was so devoted to Egyptian culture and religion that one of his primary motivations for the conquest was his outrage at the Egyptian rulers' neglect of the temples of Amun. He was not conquering a foreign civilization. He was reclaiming his own. Piye's successors, Shabaka, Shebitku, Taharqa, and Tantamani, continued to rule Egypt as pharaohs of the 25th dynasty. Taharqa in particular is one of the great figures of the ancient world. He is mentioned in the Bible, in the 2nd book of Kings and the book of Isaiah, where he is described as the king of Ethiopia, the ancient term for the Nile Valley kingdoms south of Egypt, who came to the aid of the Israelites against the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Taharqa ruled for 26 years and was one of the most powerful rulers of his era. He built extensively throughout Egypt and Nubia. constructing temples, restoring monuments, and leaving his mark on the Nile Valley from the Mediterranean coast to deep in the Sudanese interior. His portrait statues, several of which are in the collection of the British Museum, show a man with distinctly sub-Saharan African features: broad nose, full lips, strong jaw, dark skin rendered in the dark stone the sculptors used for his image. Taharqa looked like what he was, a black African king ruling the greatest civilization on earth. The Assyrians eventually drove the 25th dynasty pharaohs out of Egypt in 656 BCE, and this is the moment that most Western histories use to close the chapter on black African rule of Egypt. But the closing of that chapter does not erase what came before it. The 25th dynasty was not an anomaly. It was not an interruption. It was a return of the Nile Valley's southern African heartland to political dominance over a civilization it had created in the first place. Nubia and Egypt were not separate civilizations that happened to be neighbors. They were two expressions of the same African Nile Valley civilization, and the movement of political power between them, sometimes centered in the north, sometimes centered in the south, was a natural feature of that civilization's long history. Let us talk about the intellectual achievements of this civilization, because we have spent a lot of time on the political and physical evidence, and we need to make sure we honor the full scope of what these people built with their minds. Ancient Egypt produced the world's first known surgical text, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which dates to approximately 1600 BCE but is believed to be a copy of a text from as early as 2500 BCE, describes 48 cases of traumatic injury and their treatment. It is the oldest known text to approach medicine in a rational, empirical way rather than a purely magical one. It describes the examination of patients, the diagnosis of injuries, the prognosis of outcomes, and the recommended treatment. It uses the word brain. It is the first text in human history to use the word brain. An African physician working in the Nile Valley 4,500 years ago wrote down the word brain and described what happens to a person when the brain is injured. That person was African. That achievement belongs to Africa. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to approximately 1550 BCE, is a medical text containing over 700 prescriptions and remedies for conditions ranging from crocodile bites to mental illness. It describes the cardiovascular system and understands the heart as the center of blood supply to the body. It contains treatments for diabetes, depression, contraception, and cancer. Ancient Egyptian physicians were performing surgeries, setting broken bones, treating infections, and managing chronic diseases thousands of years before the Hippocratic tradition of Greece, which itself borrowed extensively from Egyptian medical knowledge. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, studied in Egypt. He did not invent medicine. He learned it from Africans and brought it back to Greece. The mathematical achievements of ancient Egypt are equally staggering. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, dating to approximately 1550 BCE, and again believed to be a copy of an earlier text, contains 84 mathematical problems and their solutions. It demonstrates knowledge of fractions, linear equations, geometric progressions, and the calculation of areas and volumes. The ancient Egyptians calculated the area of a circle using a method that gives a value for pi accurate to within 1%. They calculated the volume of a truncated pyramid. They developed a decimal system. They built the pyramids using mathematical principles that modern engineers still study with admiration and occasional bewilderment. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of 1 degree. It was built to that precision 4,500 years ago, without GPS, without laser levels, without computer modeling. It was built by African engineers using African mathematics, and it still stands as one of the most precisely constructed structures in human history. The astronomical knowledge of ancient Egypt was equally advanced. The Egyptians developed one of the first solar calendars, dividing the year into 365 days. They mapped the night sky with extraordinary precision. They aligned their temples and pyramids with specific stars and constellations. The Dendera zodiac, a circular bas-relief carved on the ceiling of the Hathor temple at Dendera and now housed in the Louvre in Paris, taken like so many things by Europeans, depicts the full zodiac with remarkable astronomical accuracy. The Egyptians tracked the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, and used it to predict the annual flooding of the Nile. They understood precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the apparent positions of stars to shift over thousands of years. They built this understanding into the orientation of their monuments in ways that researchers are still working to fully decode. These were not primitive people looking up at the sky in confusion. These were sophisticated astronomers with centuries of accumulated observational data, recording and interpreting the cosmos with a precision that astonished the Greeks who came to learn from them. The literary achievements of ancient Egypt deserve equal recognition. The Egyptians produced the world's first love poetry. They produced philosophical texts exploring the nature of justice, suffering, and the good life that anticipate and in many cases exceed the sophistication of Greek philosophical writing. The Maxims of Ptahhotep, dating to approximately 2400 BCE, is one of the oldest philosophical texts in human history. Ptahhotep was a vizier under the 5th dynasty, Pharaoh Djedkare-Assesi, and his maxims address questions of wisdom, justice, humility, and right conduct with a clarity and depth that is genuinely moving to read even 4,000 years later. The dialogue of a man with his soul, sometimes called the Berlin Papyrus, or the dispute of a man who contemplates suicide with his Ba, is a text from the Middle Kingdom that wrestles with questions of suffering, the meaning of death, and the value of life, with a psychological sophistication that would not be out of place in a modern philosophical journal. These are not primitive texts. These are the products of a civilization with a rich, deep, mature intellectual tradition. And that civilization was African. The religious and spiritual achievement of ancient Egypt is perhaps the most far-reaching of all, because Egyptian religious ideas did not stay in Egypt. They traveled, they influenced, they transformed every civilization that came into contact with them. The concept of the soul, the idea of judgment after death, the notion of a divine being who dies and is resurrected, the ritual of baptism, the iconography of a mother holding a divine child, all of these ideas appear first in ancient Egyptian religion and then reappear, transformed, in the religious traditions that came after. The cult of Osiris, the god who was killed by his brother Set, reassembled by his wife Isis, and resurrected to rule the kingdom of the dead, is one of the most powerful and influential religious narratives in human history. The image of Isis nursing the infant Horus is the direct visual and conceptual ancestor of the Madonna and child. The 42 declarations of innocence in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, in which the soul of the deceased declares before the divine tribunal that it has not committed specific sins, are the direct conceptual ancestor of the 10 Commandments. The idea that a person's heart would be weighed against a feather, the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice, to determine whether they had lived a righteous life is one of the most morally sophisticated ideas in the history of human religious thought. And it came from Africa. It came from the black people of the Nile Valley, who had been thinking about justice and righteousness and the soul and the afterlife for thousands of years before Moses came down from any mountain. And here is the thing that nobody in the Western Academy wants to sit with for too long: the debt, the intellectual, spiritual, and cultural debt that Western civilization owes to Africa. Not a small debt, not a footnote debt, a foundational, structural, low-bearing debt that goes all the way down to the basement of everything Europe later claimed as its own genius. Let us talk about Greece, because Greece is where this conversation always gets uncomfortable for people who learn that Western civilization started in Athens. Thales of Miletus, who is credited as the first Greek philosopher, studied in Egypt. Pythagoras, whose theorem every child learns in school, spent 22 years studying in Egyptian temples. 22 years. He did not invent the relationship between the sides of a right triangle. He learned it from African priests who had known it for 1,000 years before he was born. Plato studied in Egypt. Plato, whose dialogues are the foundation of Western philosophy, spent time in the Nile Valley, absorbing knowledge that Egyptian priests had accumulated over millennia. The Greek historian Diogenes Laertius records that Plato studied under an Egyptian priest named Sechenufis of Heliopolis. Eudoxus of Cnidus, the Greek mathematician and astronomer, studied in Egypt for 16 months. Democritus, who developed the atomic theory of matter, studied in Egypt. Solon, the great Athenian lawmaker, studied in Egypt. The Greeks were not shy about this. They said it themselves. They wrote it down. They acknowledged openly that Egypt was the source of their knowledge. It was only later, much later, when European scholars were building a narrative of Western civilizational supremacy, that the acknowledgement was quietly dropped and Greece was repositioned as the origin point rather than the student. Heliodorus of Emesa, writing in the 3rd century CE, described the Ethiopians, meaning the Nile Valley Africans, as the first people to observe the stars and to honor the gods, and the teachers from whom the Egyptians learned, and from whom the Greeks in turn received their wisdom. The chain is explicit. The chain goes south. The chain goes into Black Africa every single time you follow it far enough. The influence did not stop with Greece. It ran straight through into the Abrahamic religious traditions. Moses, according to the biblical text itself, was raised in the Egyptian royal court. He was educated as an Egyptian. The religious and ethical framework he brought to the Israelites was shaped by his Egyptian formation. The monotheism that scholars like Sigmund Freud and Jan Assmann have argued Moses introduced to the Israelites has deep roots in the Egyptian religious reform of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled from approximately 1353 to 1336 BCE and instituted a revolutionary monotheistic cult centered on the Aten, the solar disk. Akhenaten's monotheism was suppressed after his death, but the ideas did not disappear. They moved, they traveled, they influenced. The hymn to the Aten, the great religious poem composed during Akhenaten's reign, contains passages that are so close in language and imagery to Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible that scholars have debated for over a century whether one borrowed from the other. The consensus is that the Egyptian text came first, by about 1,000 years. The early Christian church was centered in Alexandria, Egypt. The theological tradition that produced the Nicene Creed, the foundational statement of Christian doctrine, was developed in an African city by thinkers who were steeped in Egyptian and North African intellectual culture. Origen, one of the most important early Christian theologians, was Alexandrian. Clement of Alexandria was Alexandrian. Athanasius, who fought the Arian controversy and shaped the doctrine of the Trinity, was Alexandrian. Augustine of Hippo, whose Confessions and City of God are among the most influential texts in the history of Christianity, was North African, a Berber from what is today Algeria. The intellectual architecture of Christianity was built in Africa by Africans. This is not speculation. This is the historical record. And then there is the question of what happened to all of this. What happened to the libraries, the temples, the accumulated knowledge of 3,000 years of African civilization? Because it did not disappear cleanly. It was taken. It was burned. It was renamed. The Library of Alexandria, which was the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls representing the accumulated learning of Egypt, and every civilization Egypt had come into contact with, was burned. It was burned multiple times by multiple conquerors over multiple centuries. Julius Caesar's forces burned part of it in 48 BCE. It was damaged further under Theophilus, the Christian bishop of Alexandria, in 391 CE, when the Serapeum, the temple that housed part of the library's collection, was destroyed by a Christian mob. The final destruction is associated with the Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 CE, though historians debate the extent of what remained by that point. What is not debated is that the greatest library in human history was in Africa, was built by Africans and their successors, and was destroyed by conquerors who came from outside. The loss of that library is one of the great catastrophes in human intellectual history. We do not know what we lost. We can only measure the shadow it cast. And yet, even with everything that was taken, everything that was burned, everything that was renamed and reattributed and stripped of its African identity, enough survived. Enough survived in the ground, in the stone, in the DNA of the mummies, in the paint on the tomb walls, in the words of the ancient writers who saw these people with their own eyes and wrote down what they saw. Enough survived for us to stand here today and say with absolute confidence, this civilization was African. These people were black. This achievement belongs to the descendants of the people who built it. and those descendants are alive today, walking the earth, carrying this legacy in their blood and their bones, whether the world acknowledges it or not. Now let us bring this home, because we have been in the ancient world for a long time, and there is a reason this conversation matters right now, today, at this cookout, in this moment in history. The reason it matters is not just about the past. The reason it matters is about what the erasure of this history did to the people it was erased from. When you spend 200 years telling a people that their ancestors built nothing, contributed nothing, thought nothing, created nothing, when you build an entire global system of exploitation on the premise that African people are inherently inferior, inherently primitive, inherently incapable of civilization, you need to hide the evidence that contradicts that premise. You need Egypt to not be African. You need the pyramids to be built by aliens, or by a lost white race, or by anybody other than the black people who actually built them. Because if black people built the pyramids, the entire justification for everything that was done to black people falls apart at the foundation. This is why the conversation about ancient Egypt is not just an academic conversation. It is a political conversation. It is a psychological conversation. It is a conversation about who gets to be fully human in the eyes of history. Because history is not just a record of what happened. History is a story that shapes how people see themselves and how they see each other. When black children grow up in a world that tells them their ancestors were slaves and nothing else, that the story of black people begins in chains and ends in struggle, it does something to those children. It does something to their sense of what is possible. It does something to their relationship with their own potential. And when you restore the true history, when you put the pyramids back in African hands, when you put the surgical papyri back in African hands, when you put the philosophy and the astronomy and the mathematics and the spiritual genius back in African hands, it does something different. It does something necessary. It does something true. Cheikh Anta Diop understood this. He said that for African people, the knowledge of their ancient history was not a luxury. It was a weapon. Not a weapon of aggression, but a weapon of liberation. A weapon against the psychological violence of colonial education, which had worked systematically to convince African people that they had no history worth knowing, no ancestors worth honoring, no civilization worth claiming. Diop spent his life forging that weapon and putting it in the hands of his people. The academic establishment tried to take it away from him. They dismissed him. They marginalized him. They refused to grant his doctoral thesis for years, because the conclusions were unacceptable to the Eurocentric framework of French academia. He kept working anyway. He kept publishing. He kept building the evidence. And when he died in 1986, he left behind a body of work that has only grown more powerful with time, as the archaeology, the genetics, and the physical anthropology have continued to confirm what he argued. John Henrik Clarke, the great African-American historian and Pan-Africanist, said that history is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. He said that history tells a people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are, and most importantly, where they still must go and what they still must be. When you control a people's history, you control their clock. You control their sense of time and place and possibility. The project of de-Africanizing Egypt was a project of stealing a clock, of making African people believe their time had not yet come, had never been, could never be. The project of restoring the African identity of ancient Egypt is a project of giving that clock back. And the clock says something magnificent. The clock says that African people built the first great civilization. That African people performed the first surgeries and wrote the first medical texts and mapped the first stars and built the first calendar and wrote the first love poetry and developed the first moral philosophy and constructed the first monumental architecture. That African people gave the world the concept of the soul, the concept of judgment after death, the concept of divine kingship, the concept of monumental sacred space. The African people produced Imhotep, who was a physician, architect, and philosopher 3,000 years before Hippocrates, and who was so revered in antiquity that he was eventually deified, made into a god, because his genius was so extraordinary that ordinary humanity seemed insufficient to contain it. Imhotep, an African man, worshipped as a god of medicine and wisdom by the very Greeks, who later claimed those achievements as their own tradition. The clock says that when Europe was in the period that European historians themselves call the Dark Ages, the knowledge that would eventually spark the Renaissance was sitting in Arabic translations of Greek texts that were themselves translations of Egyptian knowledge. The chain of transmission runs through Africa. It runs through the Nile Valley. It runs through the libraries and temples and schools of a civilization built by black people on African soil. So when somebody tells you that black people have no history, you tell them about Narmer unifying the two lands in 3100 BCE. When somebody tells you that black people never built anything, you tell them about the Great Pyramid of Giza, a line to true north with less than 1/10 of 1 degree of error, still standing after 4,500 years. When somebody tells you that black people never contributed to science or medicine, you tell them about Imhotep and the Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers Papyrus and the Egyptian physicians who were treating cancer and depression and cardiovascular disease while Europe was still in the Stone Age. When somebody tells you that black people never produced great literature or philosophy, you tell them about the maxims of Ptahhotep and the dialogue of a man with his soul and the love poems of the New Kingdom that are so tender and so human that they make you forget they are 4,000 years old. When somebody tells you that black people were never great, you look them in the eye and you say, "We were the first. We were the foundation. Everything you call civilization learned from us, borrowed from us, stood on our shoulders, and we are still here. The pyramids are still standing. The Sphinx is still staring out across the desert with its African face, watching the sun rise over the Nile Valley, where it has always risen, over the land that the people who built it called Kemet, the Black Land, and loved with everything they had. The temples at Karnak are still standing. The tomb paintings are still glowing with color after 3,000 years. The mummies are still in their wrappings, still carrying in their ancient tissue, the biological evidence of who they were and where they came from. The truth is still in the ground, still in the stone, still in the science, still in the words of the ancient writers who saw these people and described them without any political agenda, without any need to make them something they were not. The truth has always been there. It was never actually hidden. It was just inconvenient. And inconvenient truths have a way of surviving, no matter how many times somebody tries to bury them, no matter how many noses get knocked off, how many sphinxes, no matter how many names get chiseled out of how many inscriptions. The truth is stubborn. The truth is patient. The truth has been waiting in the desert for 4,500 years, and it is not going anywhere. So eat your food, enjoy this cookout, and know, really know, in your bones, in your blood, in the part of you that is older than any name anybody ever gave you, that you come from greatness. That the people who mapped the stars and healed the sick and built the monuments and wrote the poetry and developed the philosophy and gave the world its first vision of justice and righteousness and the examined life, those people are your people. That story is your story. That achievement is your inheritance. And nobody, no academic establishment, no colonial curriculum, no deliberately damaged monument, no selectively reported genetic study, no footnote, no asterisk, and no amount of sustained institutional dishonesty across 2 centuries of Eurocentric scholarship can ever take that from you. It is yours. It has always been yours. Go claim it.